Welcome everybody. Today we're going to talk about the flyweight pattern. Flyweight pattern is an optimization pattern, so you use it not to achieve some kind of mental model, but rather to make your code more efficient. The specific optimization that it tackles is when you have a lot of objects. What you try to do is you try to reduce the amount of instances of those objects that you create. Imagine if you had a bunch of icons on screen that are the same icons. If each of those icons needed a new slot in memory, you would have a lot of duplicated memory, right? So generally you just want a reference pointing to the same icon. So icon is a little bit different from flyweight because icon is just a static resource that we're just referencing. Flyweight has to do with a functional component, right? So a component that can do something. What it tries to tackle is the complexity of state management when you're trying to reuse an object. We'll slowly work up to the example, and hopefully by the end of it you will see the abstraction and the different parts of it. So we're gonna start slowly with an icon. So again, the problem, we have some kind of icon, we want to load it from some kind of path, and then we have a button. So we have a settings button. So if you've ever seen an IDE like Visual Studio, you have a lot of internal windows. All of those windows have their own like minimize, close buttons. Obviously that is not too many objects, but still there's an optimization opportunity there. If we take an application like Word, where every single letter can be decorated essentially with being bold or italic, you might want to take a look at how you're going to reuse the letters. We're not going as extreme as a word processing document. We're rather taking a look at icons on the UI. We have a settings button that has the same icon, right? And we're just newing up the icon. And hopefully you can see the problem with this. So path to settings icon, we kind of provide a path. This is where you load the icon from. And then we have 3 different places where we're going to consume this icon. So the solutions window, the terminal window, the test runner window, and I don't know, like 10 other windows, right? And for each of them, we create a settings button. So you could probably see how we can potentially cache reuse these. Well, flyweight is essentially around caching the object and then controlling the state. How do you cache the flyweight object? In our case at the moment, it is the icon. So we have our icon. We introduce an icon provider, an icon factory. Depends on what your creation of process of the icon looks like, but I have the dictionary with the icon, right? Really simple. Just what type of icon do you want, and you grab your icon. Then you still have the button, you have the settings button, although now instead of just newing up the icon, I use the icon provider. Even though we're creating 3 different settings buttons, they're all going to be using the same icon, right? Never mind the implementation here, by the way. We are going to assume that it is thread safe, etc. Okay, we do not care about the implementation detail of the icon provider. We care about the idea that instead of creating a new icon every single time, we create a reusable one. Now, as I said in the beginning, the icon example isn't really too good because it's a static resource. So it might as well be just a pointer to the thing. We are more concerned with the runtime state. So let's say we have a transaction processor, right? So we're trying to process a transaction and there's like a million transactions going through. We perhaps don't want to have a million objects for each of these transactions. We might want to use one object and just put it through the same function with different parameters. Okay, so it's that sort of thinking here. Let's take a look at the next example and the difference in states that you can have, right? In the Designs and Patterns book, it is described as an intrinsic and extrinsic state. Also can be interpreted as internal state and external state. So whatever the flyweight is, the flyweight object, in our previous example, it was the icon, because that is the thing that we are sort of managing the amount of instances for. With this example, I am turning the settings button into the flyweight object. And the flyweight object, in our case, will have some internal state. Intrinsic state also is described in the book, which is essentially the icon. So we're not going to be configuring that from the outside. That is something that the object comes with. And then we have extrinsic state. So here we have configuration that may come from the outside. And as for a specific example, will be a drop-down menu, right? So we click on the icon, a menu drops down, and we have a bunch of options to select from. Even if it's a settings menu, maybe some kind of other files, edit, code, refactor menu, you get a bunch of options dropped down. You want to select one of those options then, right? So the settings button, we essentially give it the functionality to pass some options into it. Once we click on the settings button, options get displayed, and then we can select it further. So there is the distinction that I'm making. The way that the icon looks like, the settings icon, is the internal state. Depends on where we place it. If we place it in the solution menu, if we place it in the editor menu, if we place it in the terminal menu, the options that are going to show up for that settings icon is going to be different every single time. Let's say in the settings for the terminal, we might want to be able to configure what kind of terminal are we using. Windows Subversion for Linux, PowerShell, CMD, whatever. In the solution menu, you might want to configure how your project is displayed, right? Through the solution, for the file view, etc. Hopefully you get the picture. So the external information here is the amount of options, which are going to depend on the element. The internal state is the icon, so that's not going to change. The button is going to look the same. The options are going to look different. Internal state is the icon, external state are the options. And I have two examples here how I choose to separate intrinsic and extrinsic state here. In this example, we have a button provider instead of the icon provider. I've chosen to just pass a factory in here as a function that's just basically going to create me a new settings button. Well, you could imagine that you have a bunch of million different buttons, and you can have a different construction process for each button depending on what kind of button you get. But essentially, this is the factory that I'm just going to slap on into the provider when I get the button, and that's what's going to be triggered for the settings button. Now on the button abstraction class, I have the original button, which has the intrinsic state of the icon. And then I have the generic button that has a click function that will accept some sort of configuration. Then for the settings button, specifically, I'm saying, right, this button should be accepting a string array. And now when you click on it, you're going to be supplying a string array. That is assumed you know that this is going to be a settings button, right? So we're disregarding the type safety and how this implementation is going to look in the long run. The important thing here is that the extrinsic state is being passed into the object at runtime, right? So we can have a reusable settings button. Every single time I'm going to call button provider get button settings and the settings factory, the first time it's going to get triggered, it's going to go ahead and save it in the cache. And then I'm just going to keep retrieving that same type that the factory has created the first time. So even if I'm going to, let's say, call this like 10 times, I'm going to keep getting the same button that was originally created, right? So if I call it from 3 different components, they're all going to get the same button. And then the actual click implementation in those 3 components is going to vary. So we're going to be providing different options in 3 of those components, or 4 or 5 or 10. But the icon, the button, is going to look the same. Intrinsic, internal state is how the button may look like. Extrinsic state or external state is the options, the stuff that we're passing into the button. The main thing that you do not want to end up doing is letting the external or extrinsic state somehow affect the internal state. If the intrinsic or internal state changes, you're essentially going to shift the foundation of the whole component. You're going to essentially create side effects. So if you're going to change the intrinsic or internal state from the solutions menu, and now the component is going to behave differently for all the other components that the button is present in, the user or the customer is just going to be like, what is going on, right? That is not desired behavior, and what you want to do when you're implementing Flyweight is make a clear distinction. What is intrinsic state? Make sure that it doesn't change. What is external state? And make sure it doesn't affect the intrinsic state. Keep those things separate. Now let's take a look at another implementation here that I have, intrinsic and extrinsic states with a decorator pattern. So I've gone ahead and slapped in a decorator pattern because I think buttons, you can basically have a button and then you say, oh, I want you to be a drop-down button, or I want you to be some kind of other button, etc. Same again, we have the settings button factory. We still have the same button, although I'm not passing any parameters into the click. Again, with the settings button, when we create it, we still have the settings icon, right? So we basically assume it's just a resource and we are only always going to have one of it. And then I create the drop-down button. So then the drop-down button is going to decorate any button. In our case, it is going to be a settings button. And in here, I'm going to pass some options. So when we have the solutions, the terminal or the test runner window, or for that matter, any other window, we still have the button provider where we get the settings button and we still use the same factory, right? So we're still using the same approach as we do here. We're going to be creating the same settings button. So it's going to be one settings button, and then we wrap it in the drop down button. At this point, we are sort of offsetting the drop down button to represent all possible states of our settings buttons. However, the drop down button can be also hidden behind the button provider, and instead of providing the options of option 1, option 2, whatever options we want to display in the drop down, we can provide that in the click or some kind of setup function. So the drop down button can be a flyweight itself. In this particular example, it isn't. Okay, otherwise, the implementation would look a little bit mental and hard to look at, but just bear in mind that that is a possibility here. So the button that we're providing to the dropdown and the options for it to display are extrinsic. The behavior of displaying the options for a specific button that we've provided is intrinsic, and whatever state is required to do that. And that's pretty much all there is to the flyweight pattern. Just to reiterate, it is an optimization pattern. We aim to reduce the amount of objects that we store in memory, and the objects that we are reusing are called flyweights. In order for them to behave in a consistent manner, we separate intrinsic state, which shouldn't change and could be shared across all your application, and where the external state or extrinsic state comes from wherever you're trying to use that component and shouldn't in turn affect the internal state. Whoa, hold up. Look. This is the stuff I used to torture myself on the weekends. Now, it takes time to digest this and package it up into these videos. So if you did enjoy the content, please like, subscribe if you want to see more, leave a comment if you have any questions. And if you want to be part of the community that I'm building, make sure to join my Discord server. I also stream on Twitch Wednesdays and Sundays, 6 o'clock London time. I have also opened up a merch store. So if you do want to support me, don't just donate, buy from there. Links to all of that and my other social media are in the description. Hope to see you again and have a good day.